gentlemen, and let me welcome you to this Danube Institute lecture on the topic of the geopolitics of orthodoxy. Our talk this evening is going to be followed by a conversation, and I'll let Professor David Martin-Jones introduce our distinguished panelists later on when he begins the conversation. But it's my pleasure now to introduce to you our guest speakers, Dr. Samuel Noble, who holds an MPhil from Yale University and a PhD from the University of Leuven in Belgium. Dr. Noble's academic research focuses on the history of Christians in the Near East and Eastern Europe. He's taught at a number of institutions. I'll only mention Sciences Po, one of the celebrated Grande Écoles in Paris. And he's the author, editor, and translator of many scholarly publications. I believe this evening Dr. Noble is going to revisit the idea of Orthodox civilization, especially as it appears in Samuel Huntington's famous 1996 book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, as we now seem to be at least arguably witnessing the unmaking of a world order brought on by the invasion of one Orthodox-majority country by another. This is clearly a topic that deserves careful thought, and I welcome Dr. Noble to the floor.
Thank you, David, and thank all of you for coming out here tonight. So, in recent years, the concept of civilizational blocs, where alignment between countries is derived more from deep cultural affinities than from shared ideology or concerns of realpolitik, has become an increasingly important lens for understanding the geopolitics of what we might call a post-Cold War world, where history, if it ever took a pause, has certainly restarted. This is not only due to the rising importance of ancient civilization states such as China and India. It is also conditioned by the desire of many within the European Union to forge a clear civilizational identity for the Union beyond its utilitarian role as a trading and regulatory bloc. A good example of this line of thinking was expressed with typical panache by the French President Emmanuel Macron in a speech he gave to the French diplomatic corps in 2019. So, in perhaps happier days. He said, "The project of European civilization cannot be carried by either Catholic Hungary or Orthodox Russia. I say it with a great deal of respect. Go listen to the discourses in Hungary or in Russia. They are projects that have their differences, but which bear a cultural and civilizational vitality, which, for my own part, I consider to be very erroneous, but which is inspiring. And so we must find through this European project, which I deeply believe is also a French project, a force for inspiration for our people. It's the spirit of the Renaissance, the spirit of the Enlightenment. It is the very deep spirit of this French humanism that we have at every occasion born, invented, and which we must reinvent today." So I'll leave it to you in the audience here to decide whether speaking of a Hungarian Catholic project makes any sort of sense at all. But what I want to highlight in that quote is Macron's desire to define European civilization in contrast to traditional and, in his mind, probably atavistic Christian culture, which I take Catholicism and Orthodoxy to be standing in for. Given the urgent calls from many quarters to expand the EU to the south and east, where does this leave Orthodoxy in the equation? To turn to Anglo-Saxon discourse now, any talk of a geopolitics of civilizations must necessarily address Samuel Huntington's seminal 1996 book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. In it, alongside other civilizations, such as China and the West, in which he included both the United States and Western Europe, Huntington identified an Orthodox civilization with Russia at its core. If this were the case, then it would pose serious problems for the integration of Orthodox-majority countries into the European Union and other Western international structures. And indeed, Huntington argues that even Greece's EU and NATO membership were Cold War relics that should be left behind as Greece evolves, in his words, into an ally of Russia. He was writing in the early 90s, at a time when almost everything was in flux, and so he cannot be entirely faulted for not having perfect accuracy in his predictions. With regard to his analysis of the Orthodox world, such as it's possible to use such a term, a couple of things stand out. First, Huntington was hardly alone at that time in speculating that Orthodox Christianity might be co-opted as a state ideology in post-communist Russia. Although it should be pointed out that Article 13 of the Russian Constitution, adopted in 1993, states that no ideology shall be proclaimed as state ideology or as obligatory, and Article 14 states that the Russian Federation shall be a secular state. No religion may be established as the state religion or as obligatory. Religious associations shall be separate from the state and shall be equal before the law. More recently, quite recently under Putin, have been various civilizational ideologies and discourses that attempt to describe and justify Russia's place as a distinctive civilization state. The discourse that most emphasizes a specific role for the Orthodox Church is the so-called Ruski Mir, or Russian world ideology, which posits a civilizational unity of the three East Slavic Orthodox nations who share the common foundational event of the baptism of the Rus in Kiev in 988 AD. So that's Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And of course, in this understanding, it should be under Russian primacy. But just by the very name, claiming a Russian world is much less than claiming an Orthodox world. Nevertheless, changes to the Russian Constitution in 2020 reinforced the idea of a Russophone and at least implicitly Orthodox light culture in Russia. The new version of the Constitution recognizes a special role of Russian Orthodox Christianity in the country's history and the formation of the development of its spirituality and culture. The Russian language is recognized as the language of the state-forming people, and this is connected to historical truth. And finally, it states, the Russian Federation, being united by the 1,000 years history and maintaining the memory of ancestors who transferred the ideals and the belief in God to us, as well as continuity in the development of the Russian state, recognizes the historically constructed state unity. And it's interesting that, back when these constitutional changes were being debated, there were a lot of also structural, like real constitutional changes. It was these symbolic issues that really got a lot of press, even within Russia, and a lot of debate. And there was a lot of pushback in society from this recognition of a special role for the Russian Orthodox Church as being, contradicting other statements within the Constitution. But in any case, in these discourses in Russia, whether the official rhetoric about traditional Russian culture, which often, while giving Russian Orthodox Church pride of place, recognizes it as one among the four traditional religions of Russian Orthodoxy, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, or other popular ideas such as one another iteration of Eurasianism or the Ruski Mir ideology, all of these make Russia both bigger and smaller than orthodoxy in Huntington's terms. Bigger within Russia, where orthodoxy stands alongside rather than entirely over other recognized traditional Russian cultures or religious cultures, and smaller in that the horizons of these projects, geographically speaking, don't seek to claim full responsibility over the entire Orthodox world outside of what Russia sees as its near abroad. That is, while Russia certainly sees an Orthodox space where it is an actor seeking influence, it seeks influence rather than to constitute a civilizational core in Huntington's terms. So in the end, Huntington's prediction that Russia would come to constitute the core of a distinct Orthodox civilization would not come to pass. Now, this is both due to Russia eventually taking other ideological directions, but perhaps more importantly, it's due to the lack of really any interest in such a project in the former communist Orthodox countries, whose national historical consciousnesses very frequently see Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, and contemporary Russia as threats to national identity and sovereignty. So, second, and this is a bit more of perhaps a digression, but I think it's important in understanding Huntington and relative to orthodoxy, that the point of reference really for Huntington's understanding of this part of the world was the breakup of Yugoslavia, where in particular the population of Bosnia-Herzegovina violently divided along religious lines among Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslims, despite more or less sharing a common language. There's another example from the same time period that I think is particularly, or makes a nice counterexample, roughly contemporary to the Bosnian War, where we can see the opposite situation, where language and culture trump religious affinity. So following the independence from the Soviet Union, the Republic of Georgia was, like Yugoslavia, faced with separatism from three different regions that had been formerly autonomous under Soviet rule. So the three are South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and the map, I couldn't find a map that also had that colored in, but Adjara. So South Ossetia, the population is entirely, at least nominally, Orthodox, or the ethnic Ossetians are nominally Orthodox, but they speak an Indo-European language and are culturally quite distinct from Georgians and tied to the Ossetians on the north side of the Caucasus in Russia. In Abkhazia, the ethnic Abkhaz, probably plurality at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. They might have been at most 40% of the population, but they were mixed, Orthodox and Muslim, and the local Greek, Armenian, and Russian Christian populations sided with Abkhaz against the Georgians in, Abkhazia's attempt to break away. So in both these first cases, de facto independence was achieved with Russian support following a very violent civil war. And I mean, both regions were more or less entirely ethnically cleansed of Georgians. And this is a continuing problem in Georgia dealing with the refugees, especially from Abkhazia. The third region, though, Adjara, had historically been under Ottoman rule before being incorporated into the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, and its population, though Georgian-speaking, was still largely Muslim in the early 90s. So throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, it had broad de facto autonomy without attempting to declare formal independence. But eventually, in 2004, Georgia successfully reasserted control over the territory and removed the local strongman Aslan Abashidze without really serious violence, like happened in the two other breakaway republics. My point here with this example is that while I think it's reasonable to focus on languages and religion as the two most powerful forces in forging a national identity, there are no guarantees that religion trumps language within the Orthodox space. And really, when we're talking in civilizational terms, we're necessarily talking about specifics, and the great cultural diversity within the Orthodox space means that the specifics will necessarily vary considerably. So, moreover, as regards Huntington's predictions that Orthodox countries would have a particularly difficult time integrating into the European Union, as it turned out, Cyprus was admitted to the EU in 2004, Romania and Bulgaria were admitted in 2007, after having joined NATO in 2004, and even Serbia became a candidate country in 2012. In fact, of the 9 current official candidates for EU accession, 6, so Georgia, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Ukraine, are Orthodox-majority. And the other 3 candidate countries, Albania, Bosnia, and Turkey, have demographically or historically significant Orthodox populations. So just on this basis, the civilizational orientation of the Orthodox world is a very salient question for the future of Europe as a whole. That said, it is very striking that even with 4 current EU members with large Orthodox majorities, so Greece, Cyprus, Bulgaria, and Romania, they have never really constituted a formal or informal Orthodox bloc. And I think this is really significant. There's no Orthodox equivalent of, say, the Visegrad countries or something like this. They tend to, act in their own national interests rather than attempting to forge ties on the basis of orthodoxy. The reasons for this, in part, I think have to do with the fact that historically, especially in the period since the slow breakup of the Ottoman Empire, Orthodox Christianity, as such, has generally been highly amenable to fostering and preserving national identities, but it's not been an effective catalyst for building supranational structures. And indeed, in many, if not most, Orthodox majority countries, the local churches position themselves and are widely perceived as the chief guardians of national identity. The reasons for this national but not supranational character stem from cultural and structural factors distinct to orthodoxy, at least within Christianity. One such factor is the approach to language within orthodoxy. Unlike Western Christianity, where Latin was the sole liturgical language and long the chief language of culture, orthodoxy has, for the most part, been defined by a particular sort of linguistic pluralism. So although most Orthodox liturgical texts were originally composed in Greek, we find, for example, Georgian being used liturgically almost from the time of the conversion of the Georgians, Arabic being adopted as the language of the Orthodox Church in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt within less than 2 centuries of the Muslim conquest. And for more recent examples, liturgical use of Romanian is more or less simultaneous to its emergence as a literary language in the early modern period. A more special case is Church Slavonic, which is somewhat artificial language created during the earliest Byzantine missions to the Balkan Slavs and continues to be used to varying degrees in most of the Slavic Orthodox countries. This pragmatic attitude towards language is not exactly the same thing as a universal acceptance of vernacular liturgies. Rather, in many churches, there's a strong tendency to emphasize local classical languages that reinforce a strong connection to a national past. In Greece, a form of classical Greek is used in attempts to introduce even vernacular biblical readings have sometimes led to riots. In Russia, Church Slavonic is used to the exclusion of modern Russian, even where minority languages are used for missionary purposes. In Georgia, they continue to use a classical register of their language, et cetera, et cetera. The point being, the choice of liturgical language is very much often meant more to cement a cultural identity and specificity rather than to facilitate worshippers' comprehension. The structural factors, and this is where things unfortunately get a bit complicated, for orthodoxy's national but not supranational character lie in its distinct ecclesiology. So here it's useful to introduce 3 key technical ecclesiastical terms that are necessary for understanding how things work. One is autocephaly, which is, since 2018 at least, and the events in Ukraine have been in the news quite a bit. But it is a concept of, it basically means ecclesiastical independence. That is, a church, by being autocephalous, having its own head, is able to consecrate its own primate, whether you call it a patriarch or metropolitan or whatever you want to call it, and is able to basically have self-subsistent ecclesiastical life. It's able to, regenerate its own clergy and make its own decisions. This is based on a principle of territoriality that is very, very important for understanding orthodoxy. Starting with the very first ecumenical council, the Council of Nicaea, there was a canon that declared that you could not have 2 bishops in the same city. And this evolves in time to a principle that Orthodox churches have distinct, easily delineated territory. That is, only true in the places where, well, let's say in the Orthodox world, the Western European and New World and Australian diasporas are, everybody overlaps with everybody. It's a different situation. But, so autocephaly, so basically the ability to constitute a sort of self-subsisting institution on a territorial basis. The next is primacy, which is more a point of controversy than a point of organization at this point. So within each of the autocephalous churches, there is someone who is recognized as the primate. So the patriarch, sometimes called a metropolitan, sometimes called archbishop, who has a leading role among the bishops of that church. The question of whether there is, can be, should be, has ever been a universal primate in Orthodoxy is extremely controversial. The Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople has a very, strong line that its primacy as the first among the Orthodox churches is not merely honorific or symbolic, but that there are certain prerogatives. These prerogatives include exclusive right to establish and govern churches in the diaspora, which is not recognized by anyone outside of the Greek-speaking churches. The right to hear appeals from clergymen that have been judged by their own churches, a right that is sometimes honored by their churches, sometimes not. And the exclusive right to grant autocephaly, and the exclusive right to call ecumenical councils. All of these claims in recent years have both been contested and exercised by the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. So primacy is one of the sort of structural pieces that is most contested. The third is conciliarity. So in principle, decision-making on a pan-Orthodox level, even if there is a strong primate coordinating it, has to be made in a conciliar way by the agreement of bishops coming together. This is sort of continuing the spirit of the great church councils of the first millennium. What it means in practice is that there is a very messy process whenever there's conflict in the Orthodox Church of consensus-making or attempted consensus-making. And what it means is because there's no one with hard power, really, on the ecclesial level to adjudicate disputes, that very often churches will try to come together, have a meeting. When they disagree, they will cease to commemorate each other when the bishops hold liturgies. They will cease to allow their faithful to commune with each other, things like this. And this happens constantly through Orthodox history of the past 1,000 years and is often resolves itself, sometimes taking over a century. So, for example, the Bulgarians were out of communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Greek-led churches for over 70 years in the late 19th and early 20th century. But, in the mid-20th century, this was healed and resolved, and everybody went back to getting along. So it's part of the process. This messiness is a feature rather than a bug of inter-Orthodox relations. So an idealized example. So as Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew described it in a rather idealized form, emphasizing how it reinforces Orthodoxy's inherent dogmatic and liturgical conservatism. Here's an example from a speech he gave to a largely Roman Catholic audience, which is quite interesting, in Zurich in 1995. So he says, this system of administration of the Orthodox, or the Church's affairs based on the joint responsibility and decentralization that our Orthodox Church applies, fundamentally explains the fact that, as much as is humanly possible, she preserves the ancient tradition intact, because in the absence of centralized administration and responsibility, in order to introduce an innovation in teaching or praxis, this must be agreed upon by all the bishops or by a very large number of them, which is difficult, if not impossible. Otherwise, the aberration has no reach beyond the territory of the one who is in error and typically does not outlive him. Whereas, in a centralized system where there exists the possibility of the preponderant voice, it is enough for one who enjoys such a voice to accept the innovation and impose it on the others for the entire teaching or ethos of the Church under his jurisdiction to be changed. Moreover, it is much easier for one innovator, rather than several, to put himself at the head of the Church. It is easier for only one, rather than several, to be mistaken. So that's all to say that resistance to change and a very protracted and messy process of collective decision-making are features and not bugs of Orthodox ecclesiology. In practice, this also means that interactions between the Orthodox churches as churches rather closely approximates the interactions between sovereign states in the political realm. And so the language used to talk about their conflicts and cooperation often echoes the language of international relations. And it's somewhat useful, though not 100% useful, to apply a sort of logic of international relations to understanding Orthodox ecclesiastical relations. But nevertheless, historically, both the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Russia have, especially in the past 3 centuries, attempted to place themselves in ecclesiastical, if not political control, ecclesiastical rather than political control of the Orthodox space. Since it is perhaps a more unfamiliar institution than the Russian state, I will go a bit deeper with the history of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to illustrate this. So, in both the Byzantine Empire and under the Ottomans, the Patriarch of Constantinople had the role of being the chief bishop of the empire, exercising de facto and sometimes de jure authority over other Orthodox churches under imperial rule. In the 18th century, this even permitted the Ecumenical Patriarchate to cancel the centuries-old autocephaly of the Archbishopric of Ohrid in what's now northern Macedonia, which happened in 1767, and the Patriarchate of Pech, which is basically the Serbian Orthodox Church, in 1766, and to ensure the placement of ethnically Greek bishops across the Balkans and the Middle East. Starting with the Greek Revolution in 1821, however, movements for political independence in the Balkans were accompanied by movements to establish autocephalous national churches in each country under local leadership. A process that also took place in the Levant on an ecclesiastical but not political level. The interplay between the religious and political independence movements of this era is summarized by Sir Stephen Runciman as follows. The price paid by the Orthodox Church for its subjugation to its phanariot, which is to say Constantinopolitan Greek, benefactors, was heavy. First, it meant that the Church was run more and more in the interests of the Greek people and not of Orthodoxy as a whole. The policy of imposing Greek hierarchs and clergy on the churches of the Balkans defeated its own ends. It caused so much resentment that when the time came, neither the Serbs nor the Bulgarians would cooperate in any Greek-directed move towards independence, and even the Romanians held back. None of them had any wish to substitute Greek for Turkish political rule, having experienced Greek religious rule. Going forward in time, immediately after World War I, the defeat of the Megali Idea, the great idea to seize as much of Anatolia as possible for Greece, led to the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, leaving a Greek population there only in Istanbul and some nearby islands. The population was further seriously reduced by anti-Greek riots in the 1950s. And so from the beginning of the Cold War to the present day, the risk that Turkey's Greek population would disappear entirely has made institutional self-preservation the Ecumenical Patriarchate's primary concern. To balance its position from its perspective of being threatened by both the Turkish government and the Moscow Patriarchate, the Ecumenical Patriarchate has taken a strong pro-American orientation, continuing and expanding on its strategy of working with Britain to balance Russia in the 19th century. The emblematic event of the Ecumenical Patriarchate's relationship with America is the flight of Patriarch Athenagoras from America to Istanbul on the precursor of Air Force One in 1948, following the Truman administration's strong pressure on Turkey to accept his election as patriarch. But displays of alignment with American foreign policy continue on to the present day, one very striking example being the speech given by the head of the Ecumenical Patriarchate's diocese in America, Metropolitan Elpidophoros Lambriniades' speech at the National Intelligence University in the United States in April of last year. In the past decade, the leadership of the Ecumenical Patriarchate has also abandoned the type of conciliar rhetoric found in the quote from Patriarch Bartholomew that I cited earlier, in favor of asserting stronger and stronger claims of primacy and authority over the other churches, to the point of flirting with a claim to be primus sine paribus, first without equals, in contrast to the traditional primus inter paribus. This tendency was on evidence at the so-called Great and Holy Council held on Crete in 2016. The culmination of nearly a century of preparations, this attempt to hold a quasi-ecumenical council failed, unfortunately, in a number of respects. First of all, it was boycotted by the churches of Moscow, Antioch, Georgia, and Bulgaria. In the case of Moscow, this boycott was due to a desire to play the spoiler and growing anxiety that Constantinople would use it to attempt to grant the Church in Ukraine autocephaly. I can't speak at all to Georgia and Bulgaria's motives, which were never properly articulated in public, and in any account appear quite oblique. I was personally in frequent contact with some of Antioch's delegation for this council as all this was going on, and their motivation for boycotting seems to have been rooted in a deeply visceral aversion to Greek chauvinism, much like what is described in the Runciman quote I just read. But the council was also a failure in its outcomes in that the representatives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate who chaired its sessions insisted so strongly on keeping to pre-agreed scripts that in the end it neither fostered meaningful inter-Orthodox discussions nor made any meaningful or decisions or inspiring statements. It was really an opportunity missed. Following that, the Ecumenical Patriarchate went on to unilaterally grant autocephaly to church communities that had been out of communion with the rest of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So there was the autonomous, what was called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church within the Moscow Patriarchate, and then groups that had wanted autocephaly and that had broken away from that over the course of the 20th century, that the Ecumenical Patriarchate brought together and created what's called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. This, within much of the Orthodox world outside of Russia, had very mixed response for a couple reasons. One was the unilateral nature of this action. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, in order to emphasize its authority to do so, went out of their way to not include other Orthodox churches in this process, which would have greatly facilitated its success. And also, the famous Tomos of Autocephaly that was granted was written in such a way to deliberately define autocephaly down, to relativize the independence of the new autocephalous Ukrainian church in favor of Constantinople's prerogatives, which also made other Orthodox churches very nervous about the whole process. As it turns out, it was only recognized by, it has only so far, I think things will probably change as we go on, but it's only so far been recognized by the Church of Greece, of Cyprus, and the Patriarchate of Alexandria. This is all Greek-speaking churches. It's quite interesting, I think, the rejection of it, in particular by the Orthodox Church of Albania and of Romania, for different reasons. In the case of Albania, the Archbishop of Albania, Anastasios, is from Greece. He is very, very widely respected as a missionary and sort of ecumenical figure, and really has no political or personal connections to Russia that are in evidence. But he disagreed with the process on the basis that he saw the canonical logic, so internal sort of Orthodox rulemaking logic, of the procedure that Constantinople followed to be illegitimate. And his doing so opened up a lot, because of his sort of moral weight, it opened up a lot of space to reject this process among other Orthodox churches. Excuse me. If I could have, sorry. Sorry about that. The case of Romania is even more interesting because currently, and going back a couple decades now, Romania has been in a territorial competition with the Moscow Patriarchate and the Republic of Moldova. Romania sees its canonical territory as corresponding to the interwar greater Romanian state rather than the current borders of Romania. And so they have been, trying to attract Romanian-speaking priests in the Republic of Moldova over to the Romanian Orthodox Church, with modest success in the early 2000s until very recently, and considerable success now with strong support from both the Romanian and Moldovan states. The Moscow Patriarchate has, because of the sort of pivot position of the Romanian Church in the Orthodox world, has not, protested it as strongly as one might expect it to. It's not in a position to be able to do that. Nevertheless, despite being in, quite a serious conflict with Moscow, the Romanian Orthodox Church has not recognized the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as autocephalous. I think both for procedural reasons, concerns about competing with Constantinople, and because the Romanian-speaking parts of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that is the part that, until recently we could say was under the Moscow Patriarchate, or quite positive, and the Romanian speakers within Ukraine wanted to remain in that structure rather than in the new structure. So in any case, it's quite complicated, these things. And it's all, as I said earlier, it's really all specifics. There's specific cases. It's not easy to find patterns that are going to apply in a foolproof way. Now, to turn to Russia, I won't give a long history of Russia's attempt in the 19th century to sort of pull the Orthodox world under its umbrella. I will just talk about in recent years since 2018. So the Moscow Patriarchate, since the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, has attempted to counter the Ecumenical Patriarchate's activity in several ways. So first of all, it has appealed to traditional Orthodox ecclesiological principles of consensus and conciliarity with quite some weight, although always with more than a hint of the rhetoric of multipolarity that's common to Russian state geopolitical rhetoric. At first, in order to bolster this emphasis on conciliarity, they arranged for a meeting to be held. You can think about the Orthodox space here with a map that makes it, better than looking at the quote. The areas in stripes are disputed regions. So we have the Baltic states, Qatar of all places, Ukraine, and the Republic of Moldova. So, at first, in February of 2020, the Moscow Patriarchate arranged for the Patriarch of Jerusalem to hold a meeting of primates of Orthodox churches in Amman. So it was attended only by Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, Patriarch Irenei of Serbia, and Metropolitan Rastislav of Czechia and Slovakia as primates. The Romanian Orthodox Church was represented by Metropolitan Nifon of Târgoviște, and Metropolitan Onufri of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was in attendance, seated at Kirill's side. This was, for reasons of Orthodox decorum, presided over by Patriarch Theophilus of Jerusalem. None of the churches that recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine's autocephaly attended, and notably Bulgaria, Georgia, and Antioch, the three abstainers from Crete in 2016, also did not attend, even though the site of Amman, I suspect, was chosen to facilitate Antioch's attendance, as Patriarch John X of Antioch would almost certainly not be allowed to visit Israel by the Syrian government. So this came to nothing, really, in terms of concrete results. And while the Moscow Patriarchate until recently would occasionally bring up the possibility of an Amman format of continuous meetings to try to find a resolution to the ecclesial issues in Ukraine, well, the invasion happened and all of that sort of out the window because it's not feasible for most Orthodox churches to have such high-level contacts with Moscow Patriarchate at this point. So, more recently, the Moscow Patriarchate has decided to play a bit more of a spoiler role in its interactions with the Orthodox churches that have recognized Ukrainian autocephaly. So, in particular, there's the case of Africa. So the Patriarchate of Alexandria is in the order of Orthodox churches called the diptychs, the second in honor. And it, while historically a very small community, in the early 20th century declared jurisdiction over all of Africa, probably motivated by Greek diaspora in South Africa and West Africa. But in any case, this was recognized universally that it had jurisdiction over the continent of Africa. And, well, for various reasons having to do with anti-colonialism and sympathy for Archbishop Macarius of Cyprus in the 1950s, a fair number of Christians in East Africa became Orthodox as a conscious rejection of what they saw as colonial Anglican and Catholic churches. So there's since then been probably low hundreds of thousands of sub-Saharan African Orthodox. Fast forward to 2018, the current Patriarch of Alexandria, his name is Theodoros, had studied in Odessa as a student. He had also been the representative of the Patriarchate of Alexandria to the Moscow Patriarchate for about 5 years in the 80s. For historical reasons, this representation is based in Odessa. I actually have to go way into Ottoman history to explain why that is. But he at first strongly defended the position of the Moscow Patriarchate about Ukrainian autocephaly on the basis of his experience in Ukraine and familiarity with the situation. However, he quite quickly made a 180 and strongly supported the Ecumenical Patriarchate's position and autocephaly of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. In response, the Moscow Patriarchate has established what it terms an exarchate. So that's an ecclesiastical structure under a bishop for all of Africa. It has encouraged the defection of native African priests to the Moscow structure away from the Patriarchate of Alexandria. And though I will say that this is mostly in regions that don't overlap with Russia's military and economic adventures in the Sahel. The addition, very interestingly, the Egyptian government granted the Moscow Patriarchate a complex in Cairo. And if you're familiar with how hard it is to get church buildings and arrange anything Christian in Egypt, this is a major statement by the Egyptian government. But that is to say, that's an ongoing conflict. Additionally, a website was launched about a week ago advertising the Moscow Patriarchate parishes in Turkey, which allude to the potential that they will create a formal structure within Turkey, which would be a very direct attack on the, future of the ecumenical patriarchate. So that's where we leave it. It's not very satisfying. I don't have a payoff for any of this. But other than to say that there is a risk within the Orthodox world of a de facto split between NATO and non-NATO, or however you want to divide it, flavors of Orthodoxy that seems to be gathering steam, and that nevertheless, the fact that the majority of countries that have their own autocephalous Orthodox churches are either within the European Union or are candidate countries means that Orthodoxy is important to the future of Europe, and that these divisions within Orthodoxy and this kind of free-for-all infighting that has been characteristic of the Orthodox space for quite some time make it more difficult for Orthodoxy to add to the Christian character of European civilization. Yeah, that's kind of pessimistic, I guess. So, thank you.
Hi. This is David Martin Jones. I'm Research Director at the Institute. And we have a panel to discuss with Sam his take on orthodoxy. So we have two members of the Institute, Dr. Eric Hendricks, who specializes really in China, but has a related interest in what would have something to do with Russian Orthodoxy, namely Eurasianism. And Rod Dreher, the local writer and celebrity, who has written a very fine book on Live Not by Lies, and has a follow-up coming out shortly, I think, on something to do with enchantment. So both our respondents have some interest in this Orthodox space. So initially I'll hand over to Rod for his comments, and then Sam can reply, and then sure, Eric.
No, thank you, Sam, for that lecture. As you were going on, I kept realizing how, excuse the pun, how Byzantine all this is to Westerners. I mean, I am an American convert to Orthodoxy, and I realize even though I've been Orthodox for 18 years, there's so much I don't understand about how it works.
Well, I'll say that in principle, in terms of the practice of the faith, this shouldn't have a lot to do with it. You know,
right.
You can live your whole life very happily and piously Orthodox without having to deal with this mess.
Yeah, and in fact, it's sort of a blessing in a way that there's so few Orthodox in America that we can focus on the faith instead of these communal, international arguments. I guess that the thing that really stands out to me when we think about what has happened on the international scene in the past few years is how little people in Western Europe and the United States and New World really understand not only Orthodox Christianity, but the religious dimension of the war in Ukraine. In talking to my American friends about the war, they had no idea, none, about the place of Kiev in Russian religious identity. That it was, as you mentioned, 988, the baptism of Kiev and Rus, that where the Russian nation, the broad Russian nation, was formed. And it wasn't to take sides on either side, but simply to point out that this is not just for the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's not just an international conflict, but it has very deep religious roots. What I would like to hear from you is, as a fellow American and a fellow Orthodox American, what do you see as the major mistakes that people in Western Europe, the UK, the US, make about not understanding the religious aspect of things within the broader orthosphere, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but the split between Constantinople and Moscow?
That was a lot. Let me take what I can. To talk about Ukraine is quite difficult because there's strong tendencies, even going back to Huntington's book, to try to create very clear lines. So Huntington talked about, very famously, Ukraine as a, what was the term, torn? Yeah, a torn nation, torn between the West and Orthodoxy. But that's, I think, was a misperception on his part in a couple ways. One is that he overemphasized the role of Catholicism in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is quite similar to Orthodoxy in its theology, polity, and liturgical life, is less than 10% of the Ukrainian population, even if it is outspoken as in its self-perceived role as the bearers of Ukrainian national identity. But it's historically really limited to Galicia and the former Austrian part that was only incorporated into the Soviet Union after World War II. So it's a very distinct region that it's coming from. And so many Ukrainians, and I have a lot of respect for this, don't want to talk about what's happening as a civil war. They want to see it as an outside nation attacking them. And that's, I think, increasingly as it's gone on, it's had less and less the character of a civil war because by being attacked, this has really been a catalyst for a much stronger Ukrainian national identity that's not merely a Western Ukrainian regional identity or anything like that. But even if we go back to 2014, the division over whether to, at Maidan, to align with the European Union or with Orthodoxy was not a Catholic Orthodox decision. I mean, I would doubt that there were many Ukrainian Greek Catholics who wanted to side with Russia. But there were lots of Orthodox on both sides. And as I tried to emphasize in my talk, there was a strong desire within many historically Orthodox countries, or Orthodox-majority countries, to be a part of the European system. And that's true in Ukraine, too, among Orthodox. Another thing, though, I'll say is that I'm very concerned with another line that sometimes gets drawn that, okay, people who adhere to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that, maybe was in the past under the Moscow Patriarchate, are aligned with Russia. Because I have, many people, close friends and colleagues, even some of whom were even clergy in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or who even in the West attend Moscow Patriarchate parishes, who nevertheless have had a very visceral and strong reaction to the Russian invasion, which is to say that, talking about language versus religion, I have some friends who changed from Russian to Ukrainian in speaking with their children, but maintained attending a Moscow Patriarchate parish in the West, because these religious affiliations have to do with other things a lot of the time. And I can point to especially the role of monasticism in Ukraine. So the newly created autocephalous Ukrainian church does not really have much of a monastic presence. The major monasteries, the bulk of the monastics in the church, were very socially important for at least pious people, remained under the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Onufri, has widely always had a lot of respect as a spiritual figure and as and as a monk. And so a lot of the appeal to staying in that church has to do with that, among very religiously engaged people, has had to do with that rather than a Russia versus Ukraine thing. And now it's actually extremely complicated and ambiguous, the actual situation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Onufri relative to the Moscow Patriarchate. Because it's basically decided that it will act independently, but it's not going to use the word autocephaly in the current situation of flux.
Yeah, I guess the point I was trying to make, and that maybe I can get to it better in the follow-up, is we in the West know so very little about Orthodox Christianity at all, leaving aside the national divisions. I think about when I look at the American and Western European media at how poor the coverage of religion is in general. You know, and looking at the absence of a religious dimension in the media coverage of the conflict in Ukraine, it makes me despair in a way about about the foreign policy decisions our elites make. On a more general, less controversial point there. We've seen de-Christianization, mass de-Christianization in Europe, and it's now hit the United States. So I know some Orthodox Christians in the U.S. look to Russia and say, aha, Orthodoxy has been reborn there. But my Russian friends who actually go to church still say, no, that's really a facade, that it's really not a very religious society at all. So my question to you would be, can you compare the relative lack of importance of religious leaders of what they say in religion in the West to determining national and foreign policy in the West to what's happened to the de-Christianized lands of the Orthodox East?
That was a two-part question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Well,
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can see if I can make it easier. Is there a parallel between the de-Christianization in the West and de-Christianization in the Orthodox East vis-a-vis politics, foreign policy?
Well, the factors leading to de-Christianization in Eastern Europe are different because it's communism, right? And it was an active top-down de-Christianization and a partial and very uneven recovery from that since 1990. But one of the other differences, I mean, for the Orthodox world is that nominal religion has a lot of political power. And that we were recording a podcast with Eric and David earlier, and Eric made the good point that it's often the people who don't really believe in these things in terms of religion, but do feel very strongly about them in terms of identity, who are the most politically engaged and are the most decisive politically. And this is America is just simply not comparable because there's not a single nominal religious identity that one can sort of hold on to and use as a political vehicle, whereas this really comes prepackaged in Orthodox countries.
Right. Eric, do you?
Yes, I was. Thank you very much for your talk. First of all,
thanks.
I was going to ask along the same lines, and I don't want to. I know that this is a bit of a challenging question, but I was also interested in the de-Christianization on both sides, both in the European Union and on the Russian side. In relation to what you said about Huntington. So Huntington is a very popular, very influential figure, especially here at the Danube Institute. So his Clash of Civilizations is a prescient essay. But especially because it is so prescient, it is also interesting to see where Huntington got it wrong or partly wrong. So as you mentioned in your talk, Sam, Huntington imagined that there would be a strong Russian civilizational sphere with Russia at as a core state, and with orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy, being somewhat of a civilizational essence. And then he imagined European Union as very much focused on Protestantism and Catholicism and forms of secularism that arrive out of the cultural zones of Protestantism and Catholicism. And in your talk, you mentioned that Huntington got it wrong, first of all, of the European Union in this respect, because, in fact, the European Union managed to include a lot of Orthodox countries, so not just Greece, but also like Bulgaria, Romania. So it has included, and seemingly more easily included, large parts of the Orthodox realm into the EU than Huntington imagined. Then on the Russian side, Russia was less capable of taking ownership of the larger Orthodox realm, and you mentioned political factors, Ukraine war just being one of them, and you mentioned the peculiar unique structure of Orthodox organizational structure and theology, because the Orthodox churches have a tendency towards localism and nationalism, and they're less cosmopolitan in a way than, for instance, the Catholic Church. If that, I hope that word doesn't get me into trouble. But isn't it fascinating that to some extent on both sides, Huntington overestimated the extent to which religion could form the essence of a civilizational realm, because, of course, famously, the European Union tried to move away from its Christian tradition. And it, controversially, I must say. I mean, a lot of people think that's a great loss. But then on the Russian side, as you also indicated indirectly in your talk, nowadays in the Russian imperial imagination, and when it comes to ideologues such as Dugin, other concepts seem more important than the baptism of the Slav. So the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, is not directly it doesn't directly center on orthodoxy. They also have the concept of the North, which was trending in the 90s in the post-Soviet Union, and also not a direct reference to the Orthodox religion. Then there is Neo-Eurasianism. So these concepts, these attempts to define civilizationally a larger Russian sphere of influence, have also seemed to be moved away from orthodoxy. So what we're looking at aren't we looking at a demise of religion in the political imaginative sphere?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly for Western Europe, this kind of goes without saying, and that's why I included this Macron quote with its quite a, very typically Macron, typically French sort of rejection of religion. But yeah, I think that Huntington was grasping for organizational themes, and if you looked at things in the early 1990s, this made a lot of sense. And if you're talking, I think it would make another very interesting discussion to talk about Huntington and Islam, because Islam also has not really had a core, even if religion is in Muslim countries has remained extremely politically salient. And that's it makes for an interesting contrast to the Orthodox world. But yeah, I think religion did not prove to be the organizational principle in either Eastern or Western Europe. I mean, yes, and that is both cause and effect of secularization.
Well, I remember back when Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, for a long time, basically the foreign minister for the Moscow Patriarchate, he gave a speech here in Western Europe saying that traditional believers among Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox needed to band together to resist the effects socially, politically, and otherwise of secularism and atheism. We've seen this in the United States over the past 40 or 50 years, where now theologically conservative Roman Catholics vote the same way as theologically conservative Protestants, and theologically liberal Catholics, theologically liberal Protestants also vote the same way, the opposite way, and align with the secularists. I'm wondering what prospects you see, given, I think Metropolitan Hilarion may have said this around 2010, around then, Given the events in the world since then, do you see that as having much possibility or salience, this sort of pan-Christian unity around moral issues like abortion, religious freedom, things like that?
Well, I think, at least here I'm talking as someone who for quite a long time has been living in Belgium, that in really very post-Christian societies, it's not even about these political issues. It's when people simply have religious belief, or especially Christian religious belief, that it does lead to developing kinship in some terms. And there's all kinds of different ecumenical prayer groups and things like this. I mean, the most famous is Tizé and things like that, but there's lots of local ones, I mean, even in my town. And that, yeah, this is a natural response to, religion just not being that common in people's personal lives. I don't know how often, at least in Western Europe, the state of things, this translates into anything political at all.
Okay. I'll try. What happened there? I've got something happening. Okay. Just. Is that okay? In terms of what you were saying about, what Eric and Rod was saying about de-Christianization, in terms of civilizational thinking, Huntington was always making the point that the West was a unique civilization, unique because it had two centers, both the America and the West, but also unique in the sense that Western civilization was uniquely open as a society in a way that invited a kind of creativity and understanding that was in many ways shaped by a religious background, but had moved into a kind of a liberal understanding that was very different from all the other civilizational entities he's talking about, which seem to have a much more fundamentalist core, which is why he sees, I suppose, the Orthodox space as potentially becoming a more fundamentalist kind of arrangement, and Islam as another form of civilization, not having a center, but therefore being potentially kind of weak because it was always going to be divided between Shiite and Sunni. So I wondered what you thought of that as a...
I mean, certainly talking about Western Europe, it's, the liberalism and the lack of religious dogmatism that's evolved over the past 300 years really is its distinguishing characteristic. It's you don't define Western Europe as it's unique so much by being Catholic Protestant as you do by being the type of liberalism that evolved from those things. That's fair. I mean, but I think that's very attractive along its peripheries. And it certainly has been very attractive to former communist Orthodox Christian societies. And it makes a lot of sense that if you've lived under communism, that you would be attracted to liberal polities. And this is what's happened. I suppose the more interesting question is why that has not been attractive in neighboring Islamic societies, which that's beyond the scope of tonight.
Okay. Can we have some questions from the audience, perhaps? If anybody... Gentleman there.
Yes. Very interesting to have this view of the past, but maybe the man on the street is more interested in the future and how this educated panel sees the future interaction between these world religions which are at play nowadays, and will have or will have not a major role in shaping the future of our, let's say, Europe. Now, we have a prospect of having two ways for Europe: a federal Europe or a Europe of individual national states. The federal Europe will not do without having an army. I witnessed today the National Assembly of Austria, where a very, very neutral country, and the main ruling party, the Österreichische Volkspartei, has its head in Brussels at the European Parliament, and he said, I try to quote, "It looks that the USA and the NATO will leave alone Europe with its care for its own security." This goes, and Viktor Orban is also saying this for a few years now, that future we shall have in Europe an own army which is independent of NATO, as this Austrian had said, and of the USA anyhow. Now, your educated opinion is asked, what will be the commanding language of that army?
Okay. Well, bravo. An interesting question. Over to you, Sam.
English.
English.
Always English.
Well, you are right. 8 million people speak English in the European company, and 200 million people will speak or feel Slavish and Orthodox.
Well, I guess it would be English, but I'm not saying that makes me happy necessarily. But you started to ask about the role of religion in the future, and it is, as someone who is a religious believer, active religious believer, it's very gloomy to look in Europe to see what's happening. When growing up in America during the end of the Cold War, we looked to Poland as Fortress Europa for the faith. They had John Paul II in Rome, and Poland was holding out. When I started visiting Poland a few years ago, 2018, 2019, I would talk to young Catholics there who were going to church, who really believed the faith, and they said, oh, our country's going the same way as Ireland in 10 or 20 years. I found that so difficult to believe, but my head was stuck in the 1980s, right? And now we see, as things are happening very rapidly in Poland, even Poland is de-Christianizing, not at to the same degree as Ireland, for heaven's sake, but the trend lines are the same. And so I have a view that Christians in Europe, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, or even Orthodox, are going to have to right now start making serious preparations to live as minorities, distinct minorities within their countries, make networks to help each other, because as Brussels and as this post-Christian Europe grows in power, I think that they are not going to tolerate anyone or any group, any Christian group at least, not to say the Muslims, any Christian group that stands against them, they are going to make life very difficult and maybe even persecute. Furthermore, we see in Germany, I was in Rome back in 2018. I gave a speech there in Rome. A German approached me, a German Catholic in his 50s, around my age, said, "Sir, we know in Germany that the church, this institutional church, is in collapse. And so people like me are making preparations for how to keep the life of the Catholic Church going in my homeland without the institutional church." and he gave me some ideas about what they were doing. This is absolutely extraordinary. So I think Europe is very fast entering into a territory it hasn't really seen since the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West at the end of the 5th century. And in fact, Pope Benedict, as Cardinal Ratzinger, said something very similar.
Thanks.
Dr. Noble, thank you very much for your informative lecture. I wanted to clarify one thing. So in 2018, even before the establishment of the so-called Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which, as you rightly said, to this day is not recognized by the vast majority of local Orthodox churches, the Church of Constantinople had announced that Ukraine belonged to its canonical territory rather than to the Russian Church, as was believed in for the last 300 years prior to that. Since then, Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople had repeatedly said, when speaking about Ukrainians, that the Church of Constantinople is their mother church. Now, we know that for many years, even before 2022, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been persecuted by the state. So its clergy and its faithful have been persecuted. Their churches have been taken away by force, hundreds of their churches, in fact. Their clergy has been imprisoned. Even now, for example, there are several bishops who are in prison in Ukraine. Metropolitan Jonathan of Tulchin and Bratslav, who is 75 years old, is one example. So in your opinion, why do you think Patriarch Bartholomew, who is the head of the supposed mother church of Ukrainians, has not once spoken in defense of all those faithful Orthodox Ukrainians who are being persecuted by their own state? Is this also geopolitics? Thank you.
Well, I won't try to psychologize or speak for someone else. I think that, well, quite a long time before 2018, the Ecumenical Patriarchate had a very kind of friend-enemy relationship to Russia. That is, that it defined Russia as an enemy quite a while back before that. And they have pursued this in a political manner. There's no question about that, which is independent of the question of whether there should be an Ukrainian, or not a self-Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I think the Ecumenical Patriarchate does not have the institutional capacity to deal with political matters of the magnitude that have been happening since 2018, period. I think things got well beyond the type of project that they had. And I think one aspect of that is that the OCU, the Auto-Selfless Church created by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, has not had a particularly prominent vocal role in the post-war situation. It's kind of not known what to do with itself since then. And so I think that when bishops attempt to play politics, they sometimes don't know the consequences of their actions. And they are not, by training or vocation, meant to be able to do these kinds of things in the political sphere. So no, I don't have an answer. It's a kind of disturbing situation.
Hey, Dr. Noble, I want to ask quickly. We know that the Turkish state has been slowly strangling the Fenar, the presence of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Istanbul. If they have to leave, if the Orthodox have to leave Istanbul, the Ecumenical Patriarch has to leave Istanbul, first of all, where do you think he would go? And second of all, what sort of effect would that have on geopolitics? Surely they're having these conversations.
Well, actually, I don't think that. the Turkish state does not have an interest whatsoever in eliminating the ecumenical patriarchate. And the steps they have taken under Erdogan have not been in that direction whatsoever. Now, the pressure on this is an entirely separate question of the Greek population of Istanbul, which is slowly squeezed out. There's about less than 3,000 people, largely elderly. This is serious. But something that Erdogan did and has continued to do is, okay, so the ecumenical patriarch must, according to treaties from the, end of the Turkish War of Independence, must be a Turkish citizen. This was the complication of Patriarch Athenagoras in 1948, is that although he had been born in the Ottoman Empire, he had renounced his Turkish nationality a couple times over, because he at one point became Greek and then at another point became American. So Truman's pressure was on them, first and foremost, restoring his Turkish nationality. But what Erdogan did was to offer Turkish passports to all bishops of the ecumenical patriarchate across the world, no matter of a connection to Turkey or not, which means that he made sure to ensure the institutional continuation of the ecumenical patriarchate, regardless of the demographic presence of Greeks in Turkey. And you can think that this is both a pressure point and a potential tool that Turkey would be extremely foolish to give up, and I don't think they have any interest in giving it up. I think that were the ecumenical patriarchate ever to leave Turkey, with the possible exception of going to Mount Athos, it would not be recognized as such in any other geographic location.
We've got a question at the back from Weil.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for the riveting talk. Wael Tajimilla. So I'd like to ask a question, but also draw attention to something that I feel has maybe been a little bit lacking in the discussion so far. That is to say, the Middle East. And of course, we understand when we talk about the geopolitics of orthodoxy, we're going to focus on Russia primarily. It makes sense. But the Middle East also recently, with the Israel-Gaza conflict, has seen orthodoxy sort of drawn into another sort of battlefield. And in this case, it mainly involves the Oriental Orthodox Christian denominations, to which I'm a member. Actually, 2 members of the panel have come with me to our Oriental Orthodox Church right here in Budapest for Christmas. So at least half of you know what I'm talking about. Now, with the Israel-Gaza conflict, Egypt has seen the Oriental Orthodox Church there, with our very own Pope Tawadros Hassani, Theodoros II, take a very anti-NATO line. And at the same time, we have Armenia, another Oriental Orthodox country, with its recent conflict with Azerbaijan, in which it lost quite a significant amount of territory inhabited by ethnic Armenians, also going on the same side. So I just wanted to ask, when we talk about the geopolitics of orthodoxy, how do you gentlemen see the Middle East and the Oriental churches playing into this? Please remember that in terms of population, there are 80 plus million of us. So we're roughly 1/5 the number of Eastern Orthodox Christians in the world. So yeah, if I could hear from any and all members of the panel on that. Thank you very much.
Good question. Sam?
Okay, well, yeah, so in terms of Oriental Orthodoxy, it's even more diverse and
yes,
sort of archipelagized, for lack of a better word, than the Chalcedonian Orthodox churches that I talked about. I mean, if you have a grab bag that is Ethiopia, the Copts, some Syriac speakers in southern Turkey and Sweden, and the Armenians, and a lot of people in India. This doesn't give any unifying geopolitical logic whatsoever. The situation in Armenia is very difficult to talk about without having a clue what's motivating Pashinyan to behave in the way he has, and I have no ability to speak to that. Though I will say that frustration with Israel on Armenia's part, or on the popular level at least, has to do with Armenia's very close relationship with Azerbaijan and many exchanges of technology and weapons between the two countries.
So you mean Turkey's close relationship with Armenia's close
Yeah,
relationship?
Israel's relationship to Azerbaijan. Sorry.
No worries.
I've been talking too much tonight. the Copts are interesting because they're quite. I mean, it's a large population, but it's a population without an effective political voice. And following Egypt's line on the questions related to Israel is a long-standing thing. It's very famous that the Coptic Pope has never made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem since, well, for quite some time. And this is the pattern that's going on is the same pattern that's been followed, for many decades now. I don't have broader thoughts than that, though, that I'll venture.
Can I just say that it's interesting, Sam, that you used... you said that because the Oriental Church is an archipelago, it doesn't have a geopolitical logic, or it's not geopolitical, which is very interesting because then that leads to the question, what is geopolitics? So when we think about geopolitics, we often think in a very continuous land-based direction. So it's very interesting. Can an archipelago be a different type of geopolitics, or does geopolitics stop when the blocks end?
Well, I think that's. But the further point from that, using the term geopolitics as you have done, is that geopolitics, as Eric, points out, should emphasize the geo, and that's what other. Well, there's sort of an add-on to Huntington would be Mackinder and the idea of a heartland and a maritime powers. And the problem, perhaps, with Orthodoxy, is you kind of point out in your intro, is that it doesn't have a geopolitics, really. It's a space, and the space is kind of manipulated by what other, kind of influences are around it, whether it's the Russian state or the Turkish state. They kind of play the Orthodox for other geopolitical ends, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a fair summary of what I'm thinking. No, but going back to the Oriental Orthodox, I say archipelago with a bit of irony because both Ethiopia and Armenia are landlocked. So,
it was still a very good metaphor.
Yeah, if I could add too that one of the things that has frustrated me as an American growing into knowledge of the Orthodox world, the practice of Orthodoxy, is the way our very Protestant country just doesn't see Christianity in the East, and especially not the Oriental Orthodox. Therefore, when our president decided to launch the war in Iraq, I don't remember any discussion at all of what that would do to the ancient Christian communities there, because they were, from a foreign policy, a geopolitical point of view, to the policy-making elites and the media, they were virtually invisible. And I think that probably continues today, to Wales' point. The Christians of Egypt, the Christians of the Middle East and the other Oriental Orthodox countries, those who have always been there, they don't really factor in as much with the American public, and especially not with evangelical Christians, who are the most, probably most, among the politically active American churches, the most numerous and most powerful. In fact, they tend to pay more attention to Israel's interest than the interest of other Christian churches there, and don't understand it when you point out, wait a minute, there are Christians there already. We had a couple of years ago in the U.S., more like 7 or 8 years ago, some human rights folks from the churches got together a meeting of a lot of Christian leaders, both Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox, in Washington to make a plea for the persecuted churches of the Middle East. Senator Ted Cruz, a Republican from Texas who was running for president that year, showed up to give a talk, and he stood there and insulted everyone present and said, if you won't stand up and say you support Israel, then I won't support you. Well, nobody there could do that, because even if they did support Israel, which many didn't, but if they did, they'd be killed when they went back home. But what Ted Cruz did, because he was trying to appeal to the evangelical vote, he went there and used the suffering of these people, the persecution of these people, for his own political interest. And it didn't do him any good, I'm glad to say, but that was a clear example of the sort of thing Whale is talking about, and in a broader sense, which you're talking about too, I think, Dr. Noble, that We just don't. There's so much complexity going on in the Orthodox world that remains opaque to us.
Okay. Can we have a final question? There's a lady there.
Dr. Noble, could I take you back to a line from the top of your interesting speech? Throwaway line, you said the EU is trying to create its own civilization. How's it going?
No, I mean, I'm thinking more in at least French-speaking discourse that this is kind of a point of hand-wringing all the time. And, in the past 6 months, there have been 2 very pessimistic books about these sorts of projects. There was Amin Malouf's Le Labyrinthe des Égarés, or Égarés, and Emmanuel Todd's book about sort of the collapse of the West. And so I think that the seeking a civilizational identity in Europe is often tied to a certain kind of French ambitious pessimism.
Ambitious pessimism?
Yeah, there's a type of pessimism that also puts yourself up as very important, right? So
Is that what the Germans have been doing? Now I know what they're always up to.
Yeah, maybe, but I think and I think this type of civilizational discourse is most common in French within Europe. I'm not as aware of that happening in German.
Well, the Germans always have this notion that they're particularly sinful in historical terms, but because they are fully aware of that sin, they're secretly also perhaps the most reflective about it, which is also a plus. Anyway, that's analogous maybe to this French ambitious pessimism.
Yeah, the French know they should be Napoleon, and they're pessimistic about the ability to become him. But yeah.
So on that note of ambitious pessimism, we'll leave it, I think, and move on to other things like slitting our wrists, probably. Okay, well, thank you very much. Can we thank Sam for an excellent talk?